The writing's on the wall. It's only a matter of time, and probably not much longer now, before President Trump completely subjugates the Fed and takes absolute control over U.S. monetary policy. This video will describe the safeguards protecting the Fed's independence, President Trump's strategy to dismantle them, how Fed Chairman Trump plans to run monetary policy once he takes control, and the impact that ultra-loose monetary policy will have on the economy, inflation, asset prices, the value of the dollar, and state-directed capitalism in the United States. President Trump's assault on the Federal Reserve's independence has been relentless. He wants the Fed to cut interest rates very sharply. Thus far, the Fed has resisted. Last week, however, the president set in motion a new strategy that's very likely to force the Fed to bend the knee. On August 15th, the Trump-appointed FHFA director, Bill Pulte, accused Fed Governor Lisa Cook of mortgage fraud. On August 20th, Trump demanded Cook resign, and 2 days later, the president stated that he would fire her if she didn't step down. The message President Trump is sending to the other members of the Federal Open Market Committee is crystal clear. Vote to cut interest rates or else face investigation. That implicit threat is very likely to turn the majority of the FOMC into rate-cutting doves, beginning at their next meeting on September 16th to 17th. So I think that's game, set, match. Nevertheless, it's interesting to take a step back and review the rules of the game, just in case the Fed puts up any further resistance. The FOMC is the monetary policy-making arm of the Federal Reserve System. It has 12 voting members and meets 8 times a year to make decisions about interest rates and asset purchases or sales. In other words, about quantitative easing or quantitative tightening. Its membership is comprised of all 7 governors of the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and 4 other Reserve Bank presidents who vote on a 1-year rotating basis. There are 12 Federal Reserve Banks. Each one has a president, but only 5 get to vote on the FOMC at any one time. The president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York always has a vote. The presidents of the other 11 Federal Reserve Banks take turns voting. The 7 governors of the Federal Reserve Board are nominated by the president and must be confirmed by the Senate. Once confirmed, they serve 14-year terms. To ensure policy consistency and Fed independence, their terms are staggered so that the term of one governor expires every 2 years. Only the President of the United States has the power to fire a Fed governor, and only then can they be fired by him for cause, a term generally understood to mean serious misconduct, neglect of duty, or inability to perform. They can't be fired due to a policy disagreement. The 12 Federal Reserve Bank presidents are chosen by the board of directors of each individual Federal Reserve Bank, but they must be approved by the Board of Governors in Washington. Once confirmed, Reserve Bank presidents serve 5-year terms. The terms of all 12 presidents expire on the same day. The next date when the terms of all 12 Reserve Bank presidents expire is February 28, 2026. Reserve Bank presidents can be reappointed to serve more than one term, and they often are reappointed. Federal Reserve Bank presidents can be fired by a majority vote of the Board of Governors in Washington, with or without cause. That means if 4 out of the 7 governors of the Federal Reserve Board vote to fire a Federal Reserve Bank president, that president will be removed from office. What all this means is that if President Trump has 4 Fed governors on his side, he'll have absolute control over monetary policy. Why? Because with a majority vote of 4 out of 7 Fed governors, he can fire all 12 presidents of the Federal Reserve banks and then prevent them from being replaced by anyone who won't follow his commands. Because the Federal Reserve Board, made up of 7 Fed governors, must approve the appointment of all Federal Reserve Bank presidents. In that way, he could pack the Federal Reserve banks with Trump loyalists and be guaranteed at least 9 out of 12 votes on every vote taken by the FOMC. That would be his 4 governors, plus the votes of the 5 Federal Reserve Bank presidents he picks. He's almost there. Fed Governor Christopher Waller and Fed Governor Michelle Bowman both want to replace Jerome Powell as Fed chairman when his term ends in May. Both are being considered for the position. Both voted to cut interest rates at the last FOMC meeting on July 30th, casting dissenting votes. And both can be expected to continue voting the way President Trump wants them to vote. So that's 2 votes out of 7 on the Board of Governors. Stephen Moran will soon be Trump's 3rd vote on the Board of Governors. On August 8th, Fed Governor Adriana Kugler unexpectedly resigned her position 6 months before her term was due to expire in January next year. President Trump has nominated Stephen Moran to replace her. Moran is the chairman of President Trump's Council of Economic Advisors and one of the main architects of his aggressive tariff strategy. MacroWatch has discussed Moran's frequently in recent months in regard to his paper, A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System, which he published in November 2024. That paper turned out to be the blueprint for the trade strategy President Trump has followed since his inauguration. This was discussed in detail in a MacroWatch video in March. See the blueprint to Trump's tariff strategy, March 26th. But that wasn't the only important paper Moran wrote last year. In March 2024, he published a paper titled Reform the Federal Reserve's Governance to Deliver Better Monetary Outcomes. That paper deserves closer scrutiny now that President Trump has nominated Moran to be a Fed governor. Moran's paper calls for a major restructuring of the Federal Reserve System. The most important feature of Moran's proposed new structure is that it would allow the president to fire all the Fed governors and all the Federal Reserve Bank presidents at any time and for any reason, and then replace them with governors and presidents of his own choosing. This would give the president absolute control over monetary policy, and that's exactly what President Trump intends to get. No wonder he's so fond of Moran. Moran should be approved by the Republican-controlled Senate sometime before the FOMC meeting on October 28th to 29th. Once confirmed, he can be counted on to vote with Team Trump. That only leaves 1 vote to go. And this is where Lisa Cook and her alleged fraudulent mortgage applications come in. If President Trump fires Cook, he'll be able to replace her. And that will be his 4th vote on the Board of Governors. And his 4 votes will make up a majority on the Board of Governors, that vote will give the president the power to fire and replace all the Federal Reserve Bank presidents, and hence give him complete control over U.S. monetary policy. Nothing even close to such a Reserve Bank president massacre has ever happened before. But Donald Trump has never been president before. So even if all the Fed governors and all Federal Reserve Bank presidents currently not on Team Trump can hold their nerve in the face of the threat of being investigated and perhaps even jailed, President Trump will still wrench control of monetary policy away from them by taking over the FOMC. It's always seemed obvious that President Trump wouldn't rest until he had taken control over monetary policy. This was the topic of a Macro Watch video published nearly 9 months ago. It was called, "Will Trump End the Fed?" December 3rd, 2024. So, what will the president do with monetary policy when he becomes master of the Fed? First, he'll slash the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is currently 4.33%. President Trump has said it should be 300 basis points lower, or 1.33%.